I'm Meredith Sellers, as Adam mentioned a moment ago, and I mostly teach anatomy physiology is my background. And so together we kind of just thought of giving you some general tips. I know some of this seems very kind of broad, but we can kind of break it down. And a lot of this, in all honesty, is really for any class you take. It doesn't have to necessarily be a science class. So it could be an accounting class or whatever particular course you can really apply this. And one of the things that I know I start out with my students at the beginning of every semester is just understanding that when you're talking about studying in general for science classes, accounting classes, math classes, it doesn't matter, is that there's not this kind of one size fits all approach. If this is the way that you studied, for example, my students come from anatomy. So they have spent, 15 weeks or whatever intensely learning how they should study for anatomy. And then they come to me and they want to apply those same study methods. And they're really not successful because you need to approach physiology studying very differently from anatomy. So whenever you start a class, I always tell everybody, you got to get your feet wet. It's the first couple weeks. It's the first quiz. It's diving into the lecture for the first couple weeks that you start to figure out, okay, maybe my note card method is not going to be the best for this class, or maybe I should start doing note cards if I haven't done that before. So kind of getting out of the mindset that this is how I study is really my biggest tip. Learning from each other. Almost every class that you're in, and I know now times are slightly different, but you're in a group of some kind, and so it's looking for the opportunities to form study groups, because sometimes you learn from that student and how they might prepare their study materials, or different tips and strategies that maybe they have been using that you never even considered before. So, we really see a lot of students learning from each other in these processes. One of the big things, and this goes back to really my physiology and what I teach in terms of memory and senses and all of that, although the literature and certainly the data is out there to support, the more senses you engage with whatever it is you're learning, the more likely you are to be able to recall. And that's really the essence of what we want to do on an exam, right? Or any type of assessment, is to be able to retrieve and recall that information. So, sometimes it seems like overkill, but if it's a difficult area for you, you're listening to that recording, you are writing the notes, you're drawing pictures. Oops. Oh, Siri's gonna try to help me. Trying to find different ways that you might approach that using multiple different senses to do that, not just relying on just listening or just taking notes. The one thing is you learn just by talking and teaching other people, and sometimes that's not always possible, but you could record yourself having to talk through, one of the accounting calculations or processes that you might have to go through, and then listening it back and be like, oh yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Or filling out note cards and saying, okay, to your daughter, okay, I'll help you study if you help me. I'm going to give you these note cards, and can you just make sure that I don't forget any of the steps along the way? I think that's probably one of the biggest gaps that students don't want to do, is they don't want to say anything out loud. They're afraid they're going to say it wrong or not get it right. And I know, I'm sure that I can speak for Adam as well, that, when I work with somebody one-on-one in office hours, I'm like, listen, I'm not doing all the talking here. I want you to, recite what we just went through, say it back to me, and I promise you I won't judge you, because there's so much value in even having you hear and be able to kind of formulate that. I mean, think about giving a presentation or sitting through an interview, right? How you have to know something well enough to be able to say it out loud and remember what's going to come next, by being able to put it, to say it out loud, to be able to talk through it. And a couple other things that I want Adam to add to this as well, but making those connections, if you ever follow some of the documentaries and stories about people that quote unquote have this photographic memory, or they can remember these just massive amounts of details, one of the things that they learn is how to make connections. So, sometimes we do something simple like a mnemonic, and that's not quite to this level, but we might have a mnemonic to remember the 12 cranial nerves. Or we might make a story out of how the muscles contract and talk about, you know, somebody taking a ferry that goes over to that island and then the boat docks, like the neurotransmitter, you know, like they make this whole picture, this story of something that really isn't that exciting, muscle contraction, but they turn it into this, you know, wonderful vacation that they want to take to go to Greece, and you have to take the ferry to go to the port. And again, just adding that kind of visualization and adding that kind of emotional element to it, making it something you are a little bit more interested in, seems silly, but can really help you to recall. Or when you sit down to take that test on a piece of paper or on a computer screen, and you're like, oh my gosh, what is that neurotransmitter? And you're like, picture the boat going across, you know, it just triggers, again, more of those neural connections in your brain to help you to be able to remember it. So, you know, I do this a lot with physiology, and I'm sure Adam can talk about it with OChem too, that, you know, for me, sometimes it's easy to think about, okay, do you have a family member that has gone through, let's say, an injury, or has had MS, or has gone through cancer? And then, you know, not that we want to take sometimes positive or negative emotions, but being able to connect that information to somebody that has a meaning to you, or something that has a meaning in your life. Again, the ability to recall that is going to be a big, big factor. And then let me leave the last one. Adam, do you want to add anything to that? Anything that you give advice for students in terms of kind of that preparation studying?
Well, so on the topic of just remembering, or just being able to trigger a memory and remember something. And that's, I always, you know, personally, I kind of have my own conflict with trying to memorize, because I feel like learning and memorization are two different things. But when it comes to just having to prove that you can take some amount of information, commit it to memory, even if it's just for a fixed short period of time, turn around and, you know, regurgitate it. Smell, out of all the senses, smell is the one that really triggers memories in ways that you can't even almost explain. It just happens to be the case. Like I can remember things that were on my junior English class test when we had to give an essay response. We were told what we were going to have to respond to. And I just happened to be burning this incense my mom bought a whole bunch of from some dead shop. And so I'm sitting here burning this one flavor of incense. And when we got into class, you know, I kind of totally drew a blank, couldn't remember anything. But when I got home, walked in the house, and could still smell the residual incense, it all came rushing back, like to the point where I could even remember what I was wearing to this day while I was studying for the test. And just the way that those connections are made when it's associated with that sense is very significant. So when I hear people say chew mint gum during a test, and they say mint is relaxing and all that, and I think like, well, I mean, if you're chewing mint gum while you're studying and then you're chewing on the mint gum during the test, you can kind of have the faith that your memory is going to really work for you instead of against you. The other thing is, as far as making connections, so there's these people that will compete in these memory competitions, and they may be given 50, like, and this is no exaggeration, 50 decks of cards. Mm-hmm. And each deck of cards obviously has 52 cards in it. So, I mean, you're talking about over 2,500 cards that you're trying to keep track of and not only like the suit, the number on the card, like ace, jack, two, clubs, hearts, spades, but in the order from beginning to end in each deck of cards, 50 decks of cards, and they're given a couple hours to do it. They simply just create a story, a memorable story that triggers all them to remember. So like if I'm trying to remember pi is 3.14, and this is a silly example, but maybe I have 3 siblings and 4 kids, all right, just to something up, like clearly it's not something I need to try to remember how many brothers and sisters I have or how many children I have, but I could say like, yeah, remember that one time all of my siblings came in and told me I had one chance to save my children from certain death? And that just remembers like, all right, the siblings, there's 3 of them. They gave me one chance to save my kids. There's 4 of them, 3, 1, 4. Like, you know, those kinds of things are almost impossible to forget. And so it's not really so much remembering the number, it's remembering something that is like a sure thing trigger for what it is you're trying to remember. Sometimes we try to remember things too literally, when really we just need to remember a connection to what it is we're trying to know.
Exactly. No, that's great. And the other piece that we have here is that, and this is probably more relevant now than ever, although if you've taken any web or blended classes, you've probably had these scenarios, is, you know, the practicing. So I think especially for that first exam, knowing, okay, you have, you know, OChem, let's say you've got 12 problems and 50 minutes to take that test. And then the first time you go in to do those 12 problems in 50 minutes, it's overwhelming because you didn't really have that time factor down. So I always tell my students, one of the things that I do in my classes, and I know Adam might as well, but is that I make them take quizzes that mirror the same time frame that they'll have on the exam. So just if you have exams or quizzes, let's say, or low stakes assessments, self-assessments that you can do that are open-ended for time, try to force yourself to be like, okay, I need to, prepare for that time scenario, just like if you were going to go run a race, right? You can't just go out and run the race without knowing maybe what your pace might be or practicing the timing of it, because especially now with virtual, it's so important.
Well, and I'm completely obsessed with the practice instead of studying being more valuable, especially with science and math type courses. You have to sit down and do an action or a series of actions in order to take a test. Usually involves writing something. I know in this current climate, it might be a lot of clicking, but when you have paper in front of you and you're taking a paper-based exam, then if you're constantly spending all of this time studying by reading through the book, or let's say only writing down notes, like you're preparing to study. You're like, in my opinion, that's preparation to practice for taking an exam. Like you're not really practicing or doing what it is that you really need to be good at doing when you take the exam itself. So in organic chemistry, I tell students, you've got to write this stuff out. Every moment you spend studying, or whatever you want to call it, and you're not actually burning through paper or getting a cramp in your hand, like then you're not really actually studying or practicing the way that you should be. Because when you sit down and take a test, I'm going to expect you to demonstrate not just that you know it, I'm going to expect you to record it, write it down, write through reaction mechanisms, write the products of reactions. Too many students just rely only on remembering things. And then they sit down and perhaps for the first time, like really spending an hour or 2 hours writing everything out. So if you want to be good at doing that for an hour or two on a test, then you should be spending 1 or 2 hours writing out and doing practice problems, over and over and over again. So that's my observation is a lot of students, I think, don't seize the opportunity to do well on an exam because the way that they're spending their time isn't just time well spent.
And one piece too, and I know not every professor that you have will always have things like review sheets or practice problems and things of that nature. But, I, for example, in my physiology class, I do give my students review sheets. And it's interesting when I hear the comments, the students are like, oh yeah, that, 5 points, she's given us 5 points, or she's not giving us any points. And this thing was like 5 pages long or whatever. Like that's not worth my time per se. And it just kills me because there's so much value in doing those review sheets if you have them and writing them out. And I'm not going to judge because I know you said you have a junior as well, but I can say personally for myself, who has a child around that age, that I could type all day, and I've done a gazillion reports where I can type all day, and I can't tell you what I wrote, because that tactile typing is not anywhere near the same as writing things out, writing the words, drawing the pictures, putting arrows and diagrams and things like that. So if you are doing review sheets, kind of along this before we move on to the actual test taking, the preparation with the tactile writing things out, I just can't emphasize the value of that in addition to the speaking I talked about earlier. So if we kind of go on, we kind of have it, the practice, the performance, the exam taking, et cetera, and then the review is, we have 3 massive slides. That's it. We're not going to kill you with a PowerPoint today. So the performance aspect, when we were talking about, this session and what we wanted to share with you, we were talking about, okay, when you're in the exam, you're taking the exam, right? You're actually, performing now with what you prepared in terms of your studying. We alluded to this earlier as we were talking about, chewing the mint gum, having that candle. And the nice part is you can't walk into the testing center or your classroom necessarily with a candle with a certain sense. But if you're taking it from the comfort of your own home, then yes, light that wonderful candle that you were studying with, and then put that candle on when you're taking that exam, or as we talked about the different scents. And this is just my physiology knowledge for you all. Your sense of smell, olfaction, goes to your limbic system first, then on into the other higher levels of your brain. So that's why your sense of smell is so powerful with that emotional connection and memory. I always tell my students, one of the things, I don't know if you had this in any of your classes, but we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight aspect of our human physiology. And the interesting part is too much of it is not a good thing, but having a little bit of sympathetic actually helps us to be able to focus. Now, not the case if somebody has an attention deficit disorder, but you want almost that little bit, not anxiety, but you want that like, okay, you know, you want to kind of get your body flowing per se to kind of be ready to tackle something that puts you a little bit in that fight or flight mode. So, you know, you don't want to be so chill and so calm that you're like, yeah, this is fine, I'm good. You know, you almost want your body to kind of be in that sympathetic mode and that focused mode, I guess, more than anything. Couple little breakdowns for multiple choice questions, and some of this I'm sure you might have been told before, but just kind of reiterating. You know, I always tell my students, you need to read the question, read all of the answer choices, and then go back and reread the question, because sometimes we read it how we want to read it versus how it's actually written, right? You know, Professor Keller, Dr. Keller gave me these examples a million times about this one particular organic molecule. So when I read that question, it's got to be that one because he used that example. But oh, wait a minute. In the test question, he put the other one that we didn't talk about. So when you go back to reread it, you oftentimes will kind of get that last check, make sure that you have, you know, the right content or the right information before you would go back and look at your choices. So I always tell my students, take that extra step because you'll be amazed at how many times you didn't pick out the correct information. And then, you know, just because there's all of the above doesn't mean it's the right answer. Don't always pick the first thing because there might be an A and B, a B and C, or all of the above, right? So you want to make sure you're reading the question again and all the answer choices for sure. One of the things I'll jump to is crossing out the things you know can't be correct, which it was funny. My last exam I gave, gosh, I'm trying to remember the word, but I made up a word. I was really proud because it sounded kind of cool, but it was totally fake and totally made up. And several of the students I was going over there with their exam, they picked that choice. I'm like, why did you pick that? Do you remember reading that at all? And they're like, no, it sounded kind of interesting. Okay, yeah, I totally made that word up. So, you know, if it sounds interesting, but you've never heard it before, cross it off. You know that it's not a choice. Eliminate the things that maybe you know absolutely can't be correct. Or, you know, if you're looking at something with organic terminology, I'll let Dr. Keller explain. But for me, if I know I'm looking for something that has to be a left-sided deficit with vision, well, I'm going to cross off anything that says the right side, because now I can focus on the two answer choices that have the left side in them and focus my energy on just the ones that I know could be correct.
Well, and some of these questions are by design, are meant to be something that they assume the student at the level at which this exam is aimed simply could not answer it correctly, but will have to resort to eliminating the answers that are illogical or just couldn't be correct. You know, so the question is about a particular, and I was even telling Meredith this example earlier because it's one of those things you never forget. This enzyme, the lipase does which of the following jobs in the body? And there's all a bunch of things, I have no idea what the enzyme was. It wasn't lipase, it was something else. And I'm looking at all these other things. I'm like, this isn't even anything we've tried to learn. I don't understand. And really what the question was meant to do was for me to recognize that lipase has an ASE ending on it. So it's an enzyme. Even if I have no idea what this enzyme is for, I know it is an enzyme. And 3 of the 4 choices were things that enzymes don't do. All you're meant to do is trust in the fact that you know what an enzyme can and can't do. And so now pick out the one thing of the 4 that aligns with what enzymes do in general, and not the 3 things that are describing what like a hormones do or something else. So it was really, like I said, some of those questions are really designed to where if you take the approach of I'm going to look for the right answer, or this is something I'm supposed to remember, then you're sunk right out of the gate. You're not even taking the right approach to it. You're still muted, Meredith.
Sorry, I had a phone call in the middle there. I was trying to mute. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, let me go back. When you share your screen, it gets all funky sometimes. Okay, so the other thing I was going to say here, are you still seeing my screen?
Yeah. I
Okay,
can see
so
it.
just want to make sure, sorry. Okay, so the other thing I had on there was have a piece of scrap paper. And if you have this, in your class that you're doing a paper test, obviously you can write off to the side on the paper. If you take a test at the testing center, they'll give you scrap paper at home, have a blank piece of paper, because even if you get stuck and you start writing something out, I'll use the example of lipase, 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 just that physical writing of that word out and kind of circling it may trigger you to remember something about the lipase. So it's okay to have that paper just to even start to write things down. And sometimes things will pop into your memory by having that or circling. I tell my students if they're taking a paper test, bring a highlighter, bring colored pencils. I don't care, whatever you need to maybe identify, cross things off. Another tip, which I know is better or only really for paper tests, is I typically will bring blank white pieces of paper to my exams. And so sometimes just putting that paper on top of the other questions, because I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't want to see that next problem because that's going to totally panic and freak me out. Put the paper down so you could only see the one question that you were working on, and then you move the paper down when you're ready to look at the next question. So it just, again, helps you to maybe segment it out a little bit and get rid of the distracting, you see that the next question is about metabolism and you hate metabolism and you're already stressed just because that's the next question. Like it kind of gets in your mindset just a little bit for that. And then Adam was mentioning about, ASE at the end. And I just kind of teach my students, and I spend a lot of time doing this, just dissecting out words, especially for some of the topics that you've never studied before. If you have hypo or hyper in there, and that hypo is low and hyper is high, okay, wait, then that has to be whatever they're talking about is low. It just really dissect it out. Genesis, we talk about gluconeogenesis. I mean, it's a mouthful and a term, my students have a hard time understanding, but I'm like, okay, break it down. Glue, that's glucose. Genesis is create. Okay, which one of these things is going to create glucose for you? So sometimes it's just, getting out of your head and getting out of that too much of a sympathetic mode to break things down to, terminology that you can remember. So ISO means same, and, little things like that. If your daughter, for example, is interested in going into science, and especially if she's interested in veterinary or veterinary medicine, any chance that they may have to take a medical terminology class, I cannot recommend that enough. And oftentimes they're a 1 credit or 2 credit, they're a pretty small stakes class, helps a ton with getting through a lot of the biology aspects, and really organic chemistry too. I mean, a lot of OChem and some of the breakdown of some of the substances and molecules that you teach, I think it comes in handy, would you say as well?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. And then for short answer questions, and again, this will vary whether you're working on problems like for chemistry or you're answering essay questions, maybe for a pathophysiology class. Again, going back, key terms. If they asked you for, identify the structure and the function and exactly what has to be done to fix this, you want to make sure, okay, put a number 1 and number 2 and number 3, because so many students see it, they answer the first part, but they end up getting points off because they didn't answer all parts to the question. So anyway, you can kind of extract out, what needs to be answered. If it's little bullets off to the side, you organize your thoughts. Okay, here's the structure, the function, and what happens. Okay, now let me write out my sentences to pull this all together. And it's hard because I know sometimes we, as faculty, sometimes we laugh. We're like, okay, this answer is totally wrong, but they did give it a good try, and sometimes it's like if you start writing something like, yeah, I really don't know the answer to this, but I do know that that hormone does this or this hormone does that. It might even trigger you to remember, oh, wait a minute, I do remember something about whatever that question was. So.
Well, and I see students like not writing anything down or not writing out their thought process because they're more worried, they're more concerned with being judged than they are with potentially getting the right answer or getting some points. Like, so, and this might be overgeneralizing, but I just see like pride, ego, things that really have to be left at the door. If you're going to take a test and you're trying to legitimately do as well as you can, you just need to check all of those things that you're also trying to please for yourself that almost are in conflict with getting the best possible score on an exam. So, I mean, I've seen students who have done the very best in my class are the ones that literally have no fear to write out something that is completely ridiculous and completely off base. But 75, 85% of what they did write out on all these different questions was dead on. And so they potentially looked foolish on, 10 or 50% of their questions. But so what? Like, because they took that approach to every single question, they maximized how well. And I mean, sometimes, especially on organic chemistry, where these aren't really multiple choice questions, they're write out your answer and there is partial credit. You can apply the right strategy and maybe just make a typographical error and wind up in the wrong place by the end. But when you can see that work and see the process somebody's using and realize, their approach is sound. They just happen to, write down a 5 or they interpreted their own handwriting as a 9 instead of a 7 or something, then they, those are the kind of mistakes that as an instructor and as a professor, you just aren't going to give that student a 0 when you're also giving a 0 to somebody who just leaves it blank and does nothing. So you really have to not be worried about being judged when you're trying to do well on an exam.
And it's so funny to me because whenever, students ask questions about what's going to be on the exam or what's the format of the exam, and I say short answer, they panic and they kind of flip out a little bit. And I'm like, you don't understand. Your odds of doing better in some cases are better on short answer questions. And especially if you give it an effort and you get a partial credit, right? Versus maybe not knowing the full answer that might be there for a multiple choice. So, not looking at short answer, flipping your mindset to be like, you know what, bring it on. I got this, I can do this. And even if I don't know it all, maybe I can get that partial credit. So having a reverse psychology when it comes to short answer, I think is also a good tip or advice that I have. And then really the last part, that I think when we talk about studying or study tips that maybe doesn't always come up where students feel intimidated maybe to reach out to their faculty about is, asking questions, and whether that's asking internal questions of yourself or asking for your professor to give you some feedback. But I always tell my students that when they get their first test back, I might have a student that gets a C that's like absolutely crying and in tears, horribly upset. And I have another student that's doing backflips like they have never been happier in their life to get a C on that exam. So as your instructor, I don't know, necessarily like, did you really, really study hard and did not meet up to your standards for this test? Or, did you not prepare at all and you were, oh my gosh, I knew enough to get a C. So I'm thrilled because now I know I can do better for the next one. So it's hard for me sometimes when a student says, I want to talk to you about my exam. This is almost one of the first questions I'll ask them is tell me where you're at. Which scenario do you fall into? And then I can give you more advice and structure, tips on how to improve for the next one. But I tell my students, I always think the first exam in any class is the hardest. And it has nothing to do with the content. It's just the way I might be giving you a test might be completely different from how you might get a test in Professor Keller's class, in the sense that, his is going to be structured a lot differently with organic chemistry than maybe human physiology. So it's just knowing what to expect, knowing the timing, knowing the mix of the level of difficulty for questions. So to always kind of have that growth mindset with like, okay, now I know. Now I have learned X, Y, and Z from that first one. I got 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it is more. How can I improve? And not looking at it as a sense of defeat, but I'm going to grow from this. I'm going to get better and I'm going to figure this out. Almost like it's an obstacle that I can overcome and encounter head on for the next one because I'm motivated to not make that same mistake or learn from my mistakes. And then I think, what did you struggle the most with? Again, is very individual. Some people might just say, oh, you know what? I didn't read the question carefully enough. And I go through exams with students, and even if they're online and they don't they don't pass them back to you, ask your instructor. They may not be able to show you your exam on the screen, but I can talk through and say, oh, you missed the question that had to do with the Romberg test. So let's make sure that you understand that you put this when this is the correct answer. I can't say I speak for every single faculty at Columbus State, but I speak for, I'm saying 90 to 95%, if not higher. Welcome that conversation to talk with you about that exam and tell you exactly what you missed and open up those conversations. And then you know what you need to do for the next one. So don't feel intimidated. Both Adam and myself, we work so much with students in their first semester and many students in their second or third or fourth or fifth semester, and they're just afraid to ask questions and to talk with their instructors. And once they get over that block, and it's so exciting because we make our students do panels to talk to future students. And every time somebody says, I just wish I would have taken that advice and gone in to ask them, hey, give me another problem. I want to make sure I understand this. Hey, tell me what I did wrong on my test. Ask me questions. Let me see if I can answer them in a low stakes, low threatening, totally constructive environment.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I could spend an hour talking about just what Meredith stated in terms of interacting with the instructor, interrogating your instructor. I mean, even before the exam comes up. So there's the right way to do it and there's the wrong way to do it, I suppose. Walking into your instructor's hours during your instructor's office hours and saying, okay, I haven't really had a chance to study for this test. So what's going to be on the exam? That would be the wrong way to go about it. But if you're going over, say, 3 or 4 practice problems and you walk in and say, I was hoping we could go over these 3 or these 4 problems. I've no idea how to start this one. I feel like I know how to do this one, but I keep coming up with the wrong thing. Whatever the case may be, you specifically ask the questions and then afterwards be like, so is this something that, is this the kind of question, would this be the kind of question we would see on an exam? And because the instructor isn't going to lie, and if they do, then maybe chances of doing well in the class are going to be, I mean, if it's built on a dishonest, foundation, but then maybe there's other things you got to worry about. But, instructors almost can't help themselves to say, well, that one, I would worry more about this one and this one here. This problem, maybe not so much, or because sometimes they'll throw just a really challenging thing on the practice problems. A student will come into my office and say, I've been working on this one for 3 hours and I'm starting to panic because I can't get anywhere with it. And, just tell them like, well, have you done these other practice problems that were on the same set? Yeah, I did those. That's not a big deal. It's like, all right, well, you're probably in pretty good shape, and then kind of dropping hints, for lack of a better way to put it, about what they should focus on more, what they should focus on less. That doesn't usually happen in class so often. Mm-hmm. So while the material is being covered, but then you can also read an instructor. Some instructors really are really careful about whether they give that 1 or 2 students in their office hours more intel than they think that 1 or 2 students should have, because out of fairness. So you ask a question, one specific thing, and say, I was really looking at this one. I feel like it's going to be on the test or something. And your instructor may clam up a little bit, maybe not provide as much guidance or on that particular question as some of the other ones you've asked. And then, not to overthink it, but you think like, well, why is it that they're kind of standoffish about this one and this one and this one? Probably because they're planning on putting questions just like it on the test. And they don't want to just step-by-step show you how to answer a question they know is essentially going to be on the exam. You're going to be able to interpret what all those signals mean after you take the first test, like Meredith said. You're going to have a better idea of what was there. But you should also diagram where the questions and content came from on that test. Like I had a biology instructor in college, and I barely passed that class because I failed the first 2 tests so badly. I didn't really go to lecture, but I knew the book backwards and forwards. It's one of the few classes where I did all the practice problems out of the book at the end of the chapter. And I felt like I really knew this stuff. Then I go in and take an exam, and there was very little, if anything, from the book on the test. It was all stuff that he gave out during lecture, and it wasn't in the book at all. So I end up acing the final because I scrapped the book, took all of the notes from class, studied with someone else, and said, can I look at your notes compared to mine? You show somebody you've taken your own notes. They're usually pretty gracious to let you compare them to their own. If you walk in with a blank piece of paper and say, can I copy your notes down? Well, some people are standoffish about that. But, when you can know where these questions are coming from, some instructors they're human like everybody else. Interrogate them, get as much information out of them as possible. If you're not getting any information out of them, and maybe you are, maybe you aren't, then see if you can track down other students who had that instructor and took that class already. And I found that the students who really don't have any shame in trying to get as much intel as possible, and there's nothing morally or ethically corrupt about trying to get as much intel as you can about what's on a test, because a lot of students do it. So if you're not also kind of playing that game alongside studying and learning the material, you might not be giving yourself the best chance possible. And I think I just see a lot of students keeping to themselves. They don't come to office hours. When they do, they don't follow up their own questions. They don't ask about the exam. They don't ask if we had to say, what's the most important skill here where I'm going to be sunk if I don't know how to do that or master that one. And you're not asking those kinds of questions, and you don't really have the intel necessary, I think, to prepare as well as you can for a test. But, and I'm probably repeating myself now, but after the test is over, look and see. In a science class, you very often may have labs and lectures that you're worried about. And if that's the case, then look and see like what percentage of the points or the questions came from lab versus lecture. What were ones that came from reading assignments that weren't covered in test, or were all the questions something that literally were in your class notes somewhere, you know, or was half of it out of a book and stuff you're supposed to read that didn't get covered in class? You know, you can start to get a better idea, because most instructors can't help but kind of leaning more heavily on one aspect of the class than others. You know, I myself tell the students in class, because it becomes pretty obvious after the first exam, is that if we don't cover it in lecture, it's not on the exam. You know, they have reading assignments and things that they have to learn independently, ask questions about if they have questions, but otherwise I don't cover it. And I'd never put exam questions on that stuff. That's not to say that's common, just saying that's me. And so, you know, after the first test, most students I see do extremely well on the second one relative to the first one. And those are the students that are looking and recognizing that all of those questions and topics came from examples I provided in class, not so much from these homework assignments, not so much from the reading assignments. You know, that's you really need to play detective with leading up to the exam, and then also debriefing yourself after, because a lot of doing well on taking a test is not necessarily just mastering all the material. It's really mastering the course, mastering the instructor.
And kind of like Adam said about the book in that biology class, you know, sometimes I found students study way too much. You know, they're great students, but they're trying to write down every single word that I said in a lecture, and they're writing down every single thing that they read in this book. And then they had this other book that somebody gave them. So when they're coming to me for feedback after that exam, and I'm like, okay, you have way too much information and you're overloaded in what you're trying to learn. So sometimes, you know, there's a gap where you don't have enough detail, but there's also a risk of having too much detail that you're trying to remember as well. So do you have questions for us, Bridget? Are there things that maybe we didn't talk about? You've got us, our full attention. Anything that maybe you always wanted to ask, but maybe weren't able to?
I rely a lot on visual aids. I learn the best if I could put a picture to what I'm learning. So when I was in my anatomy and physiology class, I was drawing pictures of the cells and the layers of the dermis and stuff like that. So if you can, I don't know how much you guys do, but incorporate visual aids in your classes, because some of mine are literally read this chapter, take this quiz, read this, and like I don't learn that way. I'm teaching myself. I need a little bit more to build on. So I'm constantly highlighting, I'm underlining keywords to make sure that I'm hitting key points, that my eyes will go towards the underlying item before it goes to all the other notes I have written down. But I learn a lot that way. I'm a visual learner, and it helps to take notes, but also it helps to try to pull out what's the most important thing. But my biggest problem is this is important to me, but it's not necessarily important to what the teacher's one's going to put on the test. I'm like, I know this, but it's not worded in the right way that the teacher presents it. So I think that's my biggest struggle, is me thinking what's important, and then the teacher actually thinking what theirs are important is not on the same page, I guess.
And in some cases, you know, with visuals, like for example, one of the things I do in my lectures is let's say muscle metabolism, just to pick a topic. Like there is a picture that maybe we have in our book, but then I also have maybe 2 or 3 other pictures of the same process, but done by a different author or a different text or whatever it might be, because I tell students, I can look at this one and it makes perfect sense to me, but another student might look at this one and this one visibly makes the perfect sense to them. So I guess piggybacking on what you were saying is, if you don't have visuals, see if you can find visuals on your own. Just searching online, okay, I need a picture of muscle metabolism, and you'll, you know, search in Google and you'll find 5 gazillion of them, and then take that picture to your instructor and be like, okay, I am a visual learner and I really got to be able to picture this. Would you say one of these is a good representation or would be helpful for me to study? So, you know, if you don't have a professor that's giving you what you need from a visual, you can ask for their input. And in that case, I've had students do that with me, and I'm like, yeah, this one's great, but yeah, you don't have to know all 12 of those steps of the blood clotting process. So if you want to cross that off and just use this as a general guide, then it's great. So you might get feedback like that.
Another issue is I don't always have the confidence to go ask for feedback or clarification, because like I feel like they feel I should know. I'm an adult and I'm in college classes, And I'm like, I don't want to. There's times I do. When I was in statistics, I was constantly asking questions. I knew I wanted to take this one time. I don't want to have to take it again like everybody else. And so I was asking questions, but she had so many visuals. We watched the videos. She went over everything in class. So it's constantly the repetitiveness of it is how I learned too. I also learned from my mistakes. I know I got this answer wrong. I know what the answer is. My mind just kind of goes back like, no, you got that wrong, you know, fix it. So I do learn from repetitiveness and the visuals. And if it's something hard and I know I want to get it done, I ask a question, but other times I'm just like, I'm pretty sure I could just teach myself and then it'll be fine. So I need to have that more confidence to go. Even my daughter, she doesn't like asking teachers for help or explaining something. I'm like, I don't know, and I can't help you. So you need to go ask your science teacher what this means and why are you doing this project and all this other stuff. So it's building my kids the confidence too that ask the questions, because the only way a person's going to teach you is the person that's teaching you the work. So that's the only way you're going to learn is ask questions.
But that's absolutely right. I mean, you have to be almost relentless about interrogating these people that are teaching these courses, you know, and just realize that even if they give you the look and you're like, wait, what did you just ask me? I mean, we went over that 50 times in lecture and you're still asking me about that. So what? Like, you know, you're still going to get an answer, and you just can't, you know, I wouldn't say look at them as like they're your opponent, but you know, when you have an opponent in some kind of match or competition, you're not necessarily thinking about what they think of you, right? You're trying to beat this person. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and it doesn't hurt to kind of look at especially at the college level, look at it the same way. It's not like you do badly, they win, you do well, they lose. But, you know, you have to kind of take that approach where what this person thinks about the questions I ask them, I couldn't care any less about that, because that has no bearing on my grade, my performance, or me learning this material. Like, that's just one human being's opinion, and so what? But so, you know, but I get what you're saying. It still means you still have to go in there and be in the presence of somebody and ask them the questions and not be intimidated.
And this seems silly, but this is a piece of advice I give to the students that start our program at the beginning is, I know this seems silly, but when I teach, especially a lab, let's say I'm teaching 3 hours of a lab, at the end of that lab, I am so mentally, physically exhausted, and I'm kind of an energetic, wacky person, I'm sure you could gather already. But, you know, like when I'm done with that teaching, like I'm just like I'm just exhausted. So if somebody's going to come up sometimes and ask me for like these really detailed questions, I might say, can you send me an email, or can we meet tomorrow? When can we make an appointment to get together? Or let's talk before class begins on the next session. So if you ever have that feedback from a faculty that didn't have that maybe warm and fuzzy, like, yeah, let's talk for 2 more hours, don't approach them maybe right after class. Send an email, you know, as soon as you get home. Hey, when can I talk to you about this? Just because I think that turns students off. And I'm like, oh my gosh, no, I want to do anything I can to help you, but I am just exhausted at the second. So I kind of give that advice a lot to my students. So.
Yeah, and if you would have done that to me, I would have automatically shut down. I would have never even bothered to ask you a question ever again. You don't think about how exhausted you are at the end of that class, but I'm also thinking like, well, you're supposed to be available to me to help me learn. And if you shoot me down, odds are I'm already building a grudge against you, and I don't want to deal with you again. So I think more kids need to understand that, like, it is hard teaching a whole class for 3 hours, and I will shut down immediately. If you come at me wrong or you respond to me wrong, I'm just going to end up being really done with you, or at least be even more reluctant to come to you again. So I'll be a little more sympathetic to that with my teachers.
And that's what I said. I always am like, please, please, please ask me, come to my office. You know, I've got students always outside of my office when I'm on campus, but I'm so cognizant of having that reaction that I do my very best. But I think also that flip side of, like you saying, just knowing, okay, maybe it's not the best time then to ask, and then you won't get that response. Hopefully.
No, this has been great. I feel bad that I'm the only one here, but I could have used this a long time ago with all my classes. I'm getting done, but I'm trying to, like, how do you relearn what you've been doing for the last 2 years? Because I never had these pointers before, and so I'm like teaching myself, but then you have people like you, like, if I had known this 2 years ago, I think classes would have gone a little more smoothly. I might be more encouraged to study, because I'm hitting that point where, like, I just want to get this over with. I don't want to study. I just want to take the stuff, pass the class, and graduate. So I am trying to be more focused on learning and actually retaining the material, not just cramming, taking the test and moving on. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to tell me about this.
Absolutely. But you know what you just said might be the most important advice given in this whole meeting, though, to be honest. Like once you start focusing on like the fact that I do want to learn this material, it's important to me to master this, or it's important to me to walk away from this class retaining this information. And when you stop looking at the exam itself as the penultimate reason why you're learning this or trying to commit it to memory, and really just invest your own personal stake in wanting to know something, you tend to just see people just start doing a lot better. I mean, there's not a coincidence why like older students that take my course always do better than 19, 20-year-old sophomores or juniors, simply because they tend to have an idea of like they're going back to school and taking this as a prereq for graduate school. So they know why they're there. They know what they're trying to accomplish. It connects to a goal that's very important to them, as opposed to maybe being 20 years old, not really even sure if you're going to keep your major at the end of next week, or change your major 50 times between now and a year from now. That when you're not really sure why you're doing it, it makes it so much harder to do well in a course. So I'm glad you said that at the end. Probably the best nugget of the whole last hour.